what is the first thing you want to know?
Yeah. So the first question we had was, we are at a cross section between comedy and relationships and mental health, because we're both comedians and we're talking about friendship, and it's going to be funny, but it's also serious and we're addressing a real problem in society. So we want to get to the top of the charts.
Yeah.
And feels a lot of growth happens if you hit that new and noteworthy, you start ranking, people start posting, oh, I ranked at the top of the charts. So we've been contemplating sort of category hacking. What are your thoughts on whether you should try to be in the comedy category, which may be harder to get up the ranks of, or versus like relationships, or even health and fitness, which is maybe even an easier category, mental health, but it almost strays a little further away from what our core of podcast actually is.
Yes. So for people that are listening, give them a sort of just quick description of what the podcast is and what the core of it will be.
Yeah. So Matt and I are part of the world's greatest friendship tradition. Every year on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, us and our 9 childhood friends vote on which friend had the best year. And they win this giant Man of the Year trophy, which you mentioned in our intro. And this tradition is not only the greatest night of the year, but it's also kept our friendship going strong for 35 years. So the podcast is basically addressing this epidemic of loneliness where people feel more disconnected than ever and have close friends. Who better address that than 2 guys who had the same friends for 35 years? So it's prescriptive that we are giving some advice about how to reconnect with friends and make new friends. There's also a comedic aspect in that we are comedians and are making fun of each other for half the time as well.
So you're going to feel like you're hanging out with your best friends.
Right. Will there be guests and interviews, or is it just you guys?
So it's really just us. Obviously, long term on the 100th episode, we'd like to have like in studio too.
Okay, so let me get into your question about charts and all that kind of stuff. So let me start in full disclosure. I should say I've had this podcast for a few months. By no means am I like Mr. Podcast expert of all time. So I can share what I think and what's working for me in my own perspective. It is going pretty well. I have ranked on the the Apple Podcast marketing charts at various points. I wish I could tell you I did some brilliant thing to make that happen, but honestly, I think it just happened and I got a little lucky. So I'm certainly not an expert on the technical ins and outs or quote unquote hacks or any of that, but I do have some expertise around audience building, and I think that can apply. So I think your question, while it's about the charts and labeling the show, I actually think it's a lot bigger than that, because I really think it's about how you're positioning yourself and your show, not just on the charts, but in the market in general, right? So the first thing I would say is there's a great book called Positioning by Al. The authors are Al Ries and Jack Trout. It came out, I think, in like the early 80s. It's been around forever. So it's a little dated, but the underlying stuff completely holds true. So I recommend reading that and not just for podcasts, but for anything, because it helps you think about how you position yourself in any market. That also applies to comedians, by the way, like how you position yourself amongst other comedians and stuff like that. The other thing I would say about the charts is that keep in mind that climbing the charts with the wrong audience is ultimately meaningless. So if you even were to get towards the top of the charts and new and noteworthy or any of that stuff in a category that's going to attract the people that aren't ultimately the right fit, it's like it's a win, but it's a hollow victory. So what I would start with is getting some clarity on who your ideal audience is. And the way I think about that is a combination of who do you think is most likely to enjoy the show and who do you most want to listen to the show? So if I were to ask you that, who do you think is most likely to enjoy it and who do you most want to listen to it?
Already from the feedback that we've gotten this week, pre-launch, it seems that the people who maybe expect to be listening to this a lot are people in our age bracket, on a lot of husbands and dads who have somehow lost their entire friend crews, but they used to have really vibrant crews and now they're like a new dad or something, haven't had the time or whatever, haven't put the emphasis on it. We've just gotten a lot of feedback.
I haven't had a lot of female fans from our individual stand-up. Probably our Instagram analytics are showing us like 25 to 54.
It's funny because I was going to ask you, because you don't really, obviously there's the Man of the Year story, but it feels like really this is a show for guys. But you guys aren't flat out saying that. You might want to consider saying that. Not that you're excluding anyone, but that really is what it's about. The other thing I would say to think about is it completely makes sense what you're saying, that initial feedback is like husbands and dads and all of that. You might want to lean into that a bit as well. It's interesting, like when you reference categories, you never reference parenting. I'm not saying that it should be in the parenting category, But I think keeping that in the back of your head in general with your messaging and positioning, because there's a whole story there, right? There's people that specifically identifies with, because it's really different. Friendship in your 20s is a lot different than friendship in your 40s or 30s with kids or whatever. So I think thinking through that about how you talk about and message the show separate from the charts, I think it is helpful for you to consider, even in little things, right? Like your intros, like your referencing, it's for these specific people. Because the other thing is, the more specific you hone in on that niche, the more opportunities it's going to create for you in terms of press. And I know we're going to get into sort of cross promotions and all that stuff later, but it's more clear. If you're a generic show about friends or about friendship, lots of people are like, we could do that. But if you say we're talking about friendship for dads and parents or 30, 40 something men in relationships, however you choose to define it, now it becomes much easier to even find the people that should talk. All those parenting, all those dad blogs or dad Instagram accounts or podcasts, whatever. So it doesn't have to be that, but I would think through to what extent are you leaning into some of those things, because you don't want to fall into that trap of, we don't want to exclude anybody. The truth is you do want to exclude people, and there will still be people that come through. The other thing I would think about, jumping back to the category charts, and I think it'll also help you think about the positioning piece of this, is I always like to assume success. So if you were to say, okay, I'm going to get to the top 20 of these categories, I'm going to be featured in new and noteworthy, but I can only be featured in one of these, as opposed to looking at it like, which is my best choice to get featured, assume you're going to get featured and go, which one would you choose? And one of the things I think that's interesting to do there is I don't know if there's a site called Chartable. So chartable.com has all the podcast charts, right? And all the categories. It's interesting though, in this context, to go there, look at the top shows on the various charts and go, which of these actually fit? Where would I want to be? I took a look just before we talked at a few of the categories, and I only looked at like the top show, but you can look at more. I went to the comedy charts, right? And it's a lot of sort of celebrity driven. The Jason Bateman, Will Arnett shows at the top, the Conan shows up at the top. So not only does that mean probably an uphill battle to get there, but it also means I don't know that their fans are, yes, they have big audiences, right? So some of their fans are who you'd want, but I don't know that it's exactly the right thing. But then I looked at relationships. So that was actually under society and culture. The relationships category, I didn't really see anything about friendship. It was mostly dating and marriage and all that kind of stuff. There's two ways to look at that. One way to look at that is, okay, maybe it's not quite the right fit. The other way to look at it is, wait a second, all these people that are looking in the relationships category, maybe that creates an opening because there's no one else doing this. I'm not recommending you go that route or not, but just how I think about it. Then I looked at the mental health category. The top show was On Purpose with Jay Shetty. Like when you look at those shows, you go, this probably doesn't quite seem right. But then I looked at self-improvement. And what was interesting to me, which is under education, actually. And what was interesting to me was the top show in self-improvement was How to Build a Happy Life. It's interesting. Like if you could be setting aside the size, right? Yeah, you'd love to be on Conan's show, whatever. But if you just look at like audience match, like How to Build a Happy Life and your friendship show, and I have not listened to How to Build a Happy Life, but just my assumption on what it is, I was like, oh, that kind of seems like a fit. And I'm just using one example from each category, but I'd go browse the top shows in the categories and go, if I had my shot, which of these would I want to be sort of surrounded by?
Well, the wrinkle, though, that we are wrestling with on that front is that we want to use this to build a brand around friendship. And one of the big things we want to do is live tour. And I'm just not quite sure you see a lot of self-improvement live tours, like first comedy live tour. We're comedians. So I'm a little hesitant to go, hey, we're just like self-improvement experts. You know what I mean? So that's why. But I do think that if there's a way to still brand ourselves in that space, to hang our hat on being, funny. So we're not like misrepresenting. That's the other part.
So here's what I'll say. And this is the other thing that's interesting. And I've had this conversation with comedians a lot, especially when it comes to podcasts and newsletters and that kind of stuff. If you brand the show, this is an oversimplification, but I'm going to do it anyway. So there's a comedy show that happens to be about friendship. And there's a show about friendship that happens to be fun. If you do the comedy show that happens to be about friendship, everyone expects it to be funny because you've said this is a comedy show. You're competing against other comedy shows. If you say this is the friendship self-improvement show that happens to be funny, you're competing against other self-improvement, and your skills as comedians, your show is going to be way funnier and more entertaining than the average self-improvement show. So it doesn't mean you have to go that way. And it is something you guys should think about. But conceptually, especially when it comes to these categories and stuff, if you think about when someone's going to the categories browsing, right? They don't know what they want to listen to. They go, I want to listen to something funny. That's really different than the person that's, I want to improve myself or I want to whatever. Oh, this one seems like it might be entertaining. So I think there can be a trap here, especially with comedians, because they're like, but I'm a comedian. I'm branding myself as a comedian. I want people to know me as the funny thing. And so they go in the pond with a million other people who are also funny, which makes it harder for them to stand out. I'll give you another example. If you were to reach out to, let's say a journalist, let's say, what's his name? The guy that covers comedy for the New York Times, Zinnemann, I think, Jason Zinnemann or something like that. Yeah. If you were to reach out to him in the comedy space and say, hey, we're two comics who launched a show about friendship, his reaction is probably going to be, great. Comedians launch shows about death and marriage and 8 million things. Why do I give it? That's not really newsworthy, right? If you were to reach out to somebody who covers, I'm using self-improvement as an example, but the self-improvement space, and you go, hey, we're two comics who have launched this show about self-improvement, it's more newsworthy. What you want to avoid is we're another two comics who launched a podcast. I think the charts and the categories and all that are ways to reinforce the positioning and the decisions that you've made. So going the comedy route, and also you can choose multiple categories. It's not like you can only choose one. So that's how I would think about it, is in terms of starting with where do you really want to be positioned and reinforce that. And in general, not falling into the, just because you're a comedian, it has to be comedy. It's actually more interesting if it's something else and broader, because there's probably a huge audience of people who would like your show that don't necessarily think of themselves as comedy fans in that way. But they're in it for something else. Cool.